Good morning. Welcome to Recovery Radio Week 2. Once again, this is W.G. McLaughlin, and I am developing this radio show podcast for public service professionals who cope with overwhelming stress every day. And I'll be just starting out. I'm refining it, and hopefully I'll turn it into a podcast as I refine my recording skills and all the technology that goes with our lives at home these days. So just to review a little bit of what I introduced last week, I'm pushing the concept of psychological safety for our institutions, for ourselves, and for greater awareness for clinicians about how we deal with professionals who are affected by their work, and especially affected in relation to not only their mental health but their physical health, and how we understand the constant exposure we have in our jobs. So Recovery Radio is about PTSD in the public service. Last week I presented recent research on mental health in the public services, and that is for first responders, correctional officers, dispatchers, and I expanded that to healthcare workers, child protection workers, those of us dealing with difficult situations every day. I explained a bit of the stuff about research on these findings and my understanding of it, based on my personal experiences, someone who's suffered it, my over 12 years of researching and working with other professionals as a psychotherapist, and then I advocated for why we need change in many areas about how we look at these conditions. There's the research I presented last week, so on about 6,000 public service professionals, and demonstrating that they had almost 4.5 times the likelihood of having a significant mental disorder than the general population. There's the numbers again. So today I want to speak to something that I believe is one of the most difficult things for us to understand as clinicians, and definitely in our institutions, and even more so for ourselves, to understand how we slowly get changed by our work, how it leads to the great difficulties we have coping psychologically, and how it affects our physical health as well. So just a reminder of what I explained about polyvagal theory, how we have, every one of us has a built-in alert system, defense system, and how our exposure really is which alters these things over time. So today I'm going to talk about a symptom that is one of the most enduring and damaging to our personal lives and wellness: negative schema. Few clinicians understand the impact of this. Not many of my clients nor did I understand when we were diagnosed, how deep and enduring this is. So long after whatever incidents or our work was, the nightmares, the particular things we witnessed, much long after those are gone and before they happen in a debilitating way, we get into the negative schema, which is basically the inability to leave worst case scenario thinking. Here's a quote by John Briere about defining negative schema, or another term for it is cognitive distortions that people with PTSD suffer. So easily triggered perceptions of oneself as inadequate, bad, or helpless, expectations of others as dangerous or rejecting, sorry, a couple typos there, and a few, I meant the view, of the future as hopeless. So, how do we get there, and how does this contribute? First of all, that quote was addressed to how children who experience trauma are affected, developing this negative schema or worldview of worst case scenario thinking, always looking for threats, etc., etc. However, recent neuroscience, and if I will present that later on, but if you want to refer to where it comes from, it's a book called The Mind is Flat, shows that from our developing age to even far into adulthood and old age, we are gathering information and creating schemes to perceive the world. So, how we gather that information and how we perceive the world is not just conscious, it's unconscious too. We can love our jobs and show up every day working harder and harder. However, in terms of our professions, you can see how it shapes the model or how we perceive. I'll give you an example. I talked a little bit last week about our training. Most of our training in our work is to think in worst case scenarios. As a police officer, you're always thinking about the potential for violence, for threats to you, threats to others, trying to maintain safety in your community. And you're given all sorts of tools to not only think about this, but to actually plan and analyze data chronically every day about it. For healthcare workers, you're exposed to people in crisis in the ER. Again, you're always thinking in worst case scenarios. Another aspect of this for us as professionals, not only are we trained to think this way, but we witness it every day. So there's some validation all the time for this thinking, which reinforces it. So, at the start, it doesn't affect our world much, and depending on, how much trauma or adversity we've already suffered, it may not be noticeable because we have, different resources to cope. And it happens on a continuum again. So, once again, referring back to that research I presented, the longer you work in the public service in those professions, the greater your likelihood of developing a mental health condition. And at the end point, often chronic PTSD, for whatever reason. Accumulated stress in our personal lives, all contributing to, as we perceive more and more these worst case scenarios, it becomes our filter for looking at the world. If you want to understand this in neurobiological terms, the more neurons get fired, the more the brain becomes hardwired. So it's almost the same as our body. If we do bicep curls every day, we're going to get huge arms. Well, it's the same for our brain and mind. If we get trained a certain way and it gets validated and we're thinking that way over and over and over again, it becomes hardwired. So the more little connections in our brains fire, the more they become hardwired. Now, as I pointed out last week, we have lots of training in our jobs about what to do, and it all comes down to how effective we can be in worst case scenarios. And that is great for us as professionals. However, there's no training for us, unless we seek it out, on how to change this the minute we walk into the door, or are dealing with complex family matters, or even simple ones. It becomes to the point, and it becomes, it starts with how we react to the world. as time goes on and these things become more hardwired in our system, it becomes harder for us to socialize, to go out, to turn off this worst case scenario thinking that goes on inside ourselves. We often turn to amoral behaviors, substance abuse, etc. It also leads to why so many people who suffer chronic PTSD or work in these professions become more and more depressed. Often PTSD goes with the diagnosis of major depression. At the end point, once it accumulates, like I said, that bicep gets bigger and bigger. Our threat system, because it develops unconsciously and consciously in a loop, the end point can often be chronic PTSD, where fear and anxiety overwhelm our perceptions in the workplace, family relationships, social relationships, and the most destructive, our relationship with ourselves. This can happen small and big. Our continuously focus on trying to keep safe, which is an unconscious process to some degree, can affect us where we deeply feel betrayed by our partners over small matters, agitated and angry with our children over the most insignificant things. Our daughter wants to wear some shorts, too shorts. Our big reaction isn't about sitting down talking to her about, well, is that appropriate or not? No, we go immediately to, oh my God, in 10 years she's going to be dancing on a pole sort of thinking. But it gets much worse than that. All of a sudden a shopping mall isn't just us shopping and in the moment, but just this unconscious level of threat, worried we'll run into someone we worked with and they'll ask how we are, or worried we'll see someone we arrested once, or if you're a correctional officer, running into someone, or someone may be present who you were involved with. And all of this is our thinking mind just trying to keep us safe, but not recognizing that it's the end point of accumulated worst case scenario thinking, of our body and mind being connected to one main thing. We need to feel safe. How this affects ourselves is quite intense over time. I've discussed a bit how it affects our family breakdown. We can easily feel betrayed by our spouses who may have just tried to avoid stress by not telling us something or avoiding a difficult conflict between us. The undue stress on children and spouses, which often leads, because our perceptions are altered in a way to be negative about the world, they're really negative about ourselves. So then once we blow up or we have a breakdown at a shopping mall or feel overwhelmed, then we immediately look at ourselves through the filter of guilt and shame, and there's something wrong with us. The impact on our communities is very strong because so many people with this condition have great capacity, and it gets lost. The negative view of ourselves, that hopelessness I said in the quote, the inability to see a future, and only able to be haunted by our past, it leads to self-destruction and often suicide. We cannot perceive that we're going to get better. We cannot cope with the overwhelming guilt and shame that we've ruined things. And a big part is also we perceive, because we have a psychological injury, we've lost our identity as a professional. And that somehow gets more important to us than our many other roles in life. whether it be in coaching, in sports, in family, as a friend, because it happens inside. Inside our psyche, we view ourselves as a risk to ourselves then, and we can't achieve safety and calm anywhere. So that's my discussion for today. I want you to think about how much this has affected your life, and also realize, as an injury, a lot of these things, I'm sorry, I'll correct that. None of this information is communicated to professionals. I don't see a lot of clinicians who understand it or work with it. And most clients I see, even though they may have been in mental health care for a long time, have not had it discussed with them, had not had education about it, and have not been provided coping strategies to deal with it. One of the endpoints of that self-destruction can be suicide. And I think we need to start really taking data on how many people who work in policing, corrections, either have suicidal ideation or may complete suicide. It is the worst case scenario for those of us who suffer the condition. So again, this is my comment today. Let's start thinking about this negative schema or cognitive distortions as one, the most important thing to assess for ourselves, our workplaces, and for professionals. Our institutions need to start educating us on it and providing us with resources to help us deal with it and alter and take breaks and be aware of our thinking and how it gets altered over time, dealing with horrific things, challenging things day to day. And I'm not saying we're not accomplished or that we don't love our jobs, but however, over time it does affect us. And we have to learn different skills to manage it. And our institutions need to be at the forefront of supporting that. And then most importantly, how we look at it ourselves. When we can recognize, oh, that's a PTSD thought, i.e. worst case scenario, even if I run into someone at the mall and they ask me what I'm doing, it's actually okay to say, well, I'm off work with a psychological injury, but I'm working on it. Or to not tell people at all. But the main thing is to take note of, well before we go to that social event, to the mall, often we're always scheming in our head, what's the worst that's going to happen to me? And then the mind-body relationship is, usually that kicks our body into that cycle of being reactive, vigilant, discomfort, pain, numerous symptoms. It's what seizes us over time, what causes us our hearts to slowly build up and get full of scar tissue by releasing so much cortisol and adrenaline into our arteries. That's one of the reasons I think people with high stress work have so many heart attacks over time. It isn't cholesterol buildup. It's those things which scar up the arteries, not because it's our even every workplace crisis, but it's because after a while we have these strong reactions to often insignificant things. And then furthermore, when we have these reactions, we go into a spiral of judging and loathing ourselves, feeling unlovable, and a very empty world. So, that's my chat today on negative schema. This is W.G. McLaughlin. Take care of yourselves. There's my information if you'd like to contact me. And I'll be talking to you again next week at this same time. Have a great day.